This is the king's pawn opening, the most popular first move, immediately contesting the center and opening lines for the queen and king's bishop. This move, 1, d6, avoids the sharp theoretical lines that often arise after 1, e5 or 1, circa 5, entering a flexible pawn structure that can lead to a variety of defenses such as the Pirc or modern defense, prioritizing solid development and piece play over immediate central pawn contention. This move establishes white's central pawn presence and opens lines for piece development, aiming for a classical pawn center common in openings like the king's pawn game or can transpose into the Pirc defense if black plays nf6 next. This move develops a knight towards the center, challenging white's central pawn structure and preparing to castle, indicative of opening systems like the Pirc or modern defense. Developing the knight to c3 reinforces control of the d5 square and prepares for a pawn push to d5, typical in the king's Indian defense framework. This move initiates the king's Indian defense setup, aiming to fianchetto the dark squared bishop to g7 to control the long diagonal and prepare for kingside castling. This move continues developing the kingside knight towards the center, preparing to castle and reinforcing the e4 pawn which black's knight is currently attacking. This move firmly establishes the king's Indian defense, where the bishop on g7 will become a powerful piece controlling the long diagonal. Developing the bishop to e2 prepares for castling kingside and supports the central pawn advance, fitting into the common king's Indian defense structure. Castling kingside is a standard and safe development, securing the king and bringing the rook towards the center of the board, which is a crucial step in most openings. This move completes white's kingside castling, a standard development aiming to secure the king and connect the rooks, while simultaneously preparing for central action or further piece development. This move, bg4, enters a well-known variation of the king's Indian defense, aiming to pressure white's central knight and potentially prepare for pawn advances in the center or on the kingside. This move develops the bishop to an active square, supporting the d4 pawn and preparing for a potential kingside attack while reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing for potential queenside castling. This move reinforces the central pawn and prepares for pawn breaks, typical of the king's Indian defense setup. This move prepares to develop the queen to a more active square, supports the d4 pawn, and aims to connect the rooks after castling. This move initiates a central pawn break, aiming to challenge white's control of the d4 square and open lines for black's pieces. This move stakes a strong claim in the center, aiming to restrict black's pieces and prepare for a queenside pawn advance, typical of many king's Indian defense structures. This move prepares to reinforce the central pawn chain and potentially reposition the knight to a more active square, possibly c6 or even b5 to attack white's queenside. This move develops the rook to an active central file, preparing to contest the open d file and support potential pawn pushes in the center. This move, developing the bishop to d7, prepares to exchange it on f3 and alleviate the pressure on black's kingside after white's pieces have reached active squares, typical in this king's Indian structure. This move reroutes the knight to f3, clearing the way for a pawn push on the kingside, and simultaneously prepares to support the e3 bishop. The move ing4 directly challenges white's bishop on e3, forcing a decision and potentially disrupting white's harmonious development within this variation of the king's Indian defense. White resolves the tension by exchanging the bishop for the knight, simplifying the position and opening the g-file for potential rook activity. Black recaptures the bishop, opening the g-file and maintaining pawn pressure in the center while developing their pieces. This move initiates a central pawn advance aimed at challenging Black's piece coordination and potentially opening lines for White's rooks. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, allowing it to influence the d5 pawn and potentially support a future c5 pawn break. This pawn thrust aggressively challenges Black's kingside structure, aiming to exploit the weakened squares and open lines for White's pieces. This move, 14, bg4, returns the bishop to a square where it was previously attacked, forcing White to consider doubling pawns or losing material, and aims to provoke a weakness in White's kingside pawn structure after the likely capture. This move prepares to undermine Black's central control by potentially playing b4, aiming to open the queenside and gain space. This move is a good attempt to challenge White's central pawn control and potentially open lines for Black's pieces, particularly the c-file, while also freeing the d7 bishop. This move addresses Black's bishop on g4, which was attacking White's knight on f3, preparing to follow up with c5 to challenge White's center. This move reiterates the bishop's position after White's aggressive pawn advance, preparing to challenge White's control of the d5 square and potentially exchange the fianchettoed bishop for a more active piece. This capture on d6 opens the d-file and challenges Black's central pawn structure, aiming to disrupt White's queenside initiative. This recapture opens the d-file for your rook and continues the development of Black's pieces towards the center. The rook now occupies the semi-open d-file, aiming to contest control and potentially support an advance of the remaining central pawns. This capture opens the e-file and allows Black to challenge White's central pawn structure, preparing to develop pieces actively. This recapture opens the f-file for White's rook, creating immediate attacking pressure on Black's kingside and potentially disrupting Black's pawn structure. This move aims to challenge White's central pawn structure and open lines for Black's pieces, particularly the rook on h8, while also potentially creating a passed pawn if White captures. The move qd3 repositions the queen to a more active square, supporting a potential kingside attack and eyeing the weak f7 pawn while keeping an eye on the d5 pawn. This pawn exchange on e4 opens the f-file for White's rook and creates an isolated pawn on d5 for Black, potentially weakening its central control and requiring careful defense. This exchange simplifies the position and forces Black to recapture, leading to a clearer endgame where White can aim to exploit the open d-file. Capturing the rook on f8 creates an open queen's file and simplifies the position, though it allows White's queen to become active. This knight recapture re-establishes material equality and offers central control, aiming to exploit White's weakened kingside pawn structure. This move 22, nf5 is a logical attempt to regain material equality and activate the knight, targeting White's advanced pawn on e4. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal after the trade, supporting potential pawn advances and preparing to contest the central squares. This move initiates a dynamic pawn break to open lines for Black's pieces and challenge White's central control, aiming to disrupt White's coordinated setup. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to control central squares and support potential pawn advances while being protected by the d-pawn. This pawn thrust aims to disrupt White's central control and open lines for Black's pieces by attacking the advanced knight on c3. The move 25, Nay2 aims to reposition the knight towards the kingside, potentially supporting a kingside attack or preparing to defend against black's active piece play. Initiated by d4. This move repositions the queen to exploit the slightly weakened central pawn structure and potentially create threats against white's kingside after white's knight has moved to e4. This move executes a tactical maneuver to regain material and simplify the position by exploiting black's vulnerable knight on d4, centralizing white's knight. This knight sacrifice opens up the d-file for your rook and aims to disrupt white's pawn center, creating counterplay and potential weaknesses in black's position. This move recaptures the knight and simplifies the position, aiming to trade off black's active pieces while consolidating white's central pawn majority. This move reasserts control over the crucial d-file, aiming to contest white's rook activity and potentially prepare for further pawn advances or piece repositioning. This move solidifies white's pawn center and prepares to challenge black's advanced d4 pawn. This exchange clears white's king pawn, opens the d-file for black's rook, and forces white to recapture, creating an isolated pawn on c3. This move recaptures the bishop after black's check, solidifying white's pawn structure in the center and opening the c-file for potential future rook activity. This move captures an undefended pawn, seeking to exploit white's exposed king and potentially create counterplay, but it neglects the immediate threat of white's central pawn majority and potential piece activity. This move defends the b2 pawn and prepares to centralize the rook, aiming to exploit the open d-file and contest control of this crucial central file. This move sacrifices the queen for insufficient material, abandoning any hope of winning by giving away too much. This move is a critical defensive maneuver, aiming to protect the f2 pawn and prepare for a potential queen exchange, which would simplify the position and reduce black's attacking chances. This move aims to exploit the open c-file and create potential threats against white's king and queen while also preparing to recapture on b2. This knight retreat prepares to challenge black's active queen and solidify the kingside by potentially repositioning to d4 or e3. This check forces white to move their king to a less protected square, allowing black to regroup and potentially exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure after the sequence of exchanges. This move is a defensive necessity to prevent white's queen from further harassing black's position after the perpetual check attempt on c1 and to prepare for king safety. This move forces white to decide between exchanging queens or allowing black to maintain significant pressure on the weakened queenside and central pawn structure. The rook returns to its back rank, preparing to defend the e3 pawn and regroup for potential defense or counterplay. As the game has reached a critical juncture where precise piece placement is paramount, the queen returns to g5 to prepare for potential exchanges and maintain pressure on white's kingside, while also keeping an eye on the g2 pawn should white's pieces be poorly positioned. This move repositions the queen to a more active central square, aiming to coordinate with the rook and challenge black's material advantage. This move repositions the queen to exploit the weakened dark squares on white's queenside and prepare for potential pawn advances or piece activity. This move aims to centralize the queen, preparing to support a pawn advance or to potentially trade pieces in the center to simplify the position. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, potentially eyeing the weakened dark squares around white's king and preparing for further central pawn advances. This move repositions the rook to a more active square on the second rank, supporting the advance of the pawn and preparing to contest the open d-file. The move 37, rf8 repositions the rook to an open file, preparing to challenge white's control of the d-file and potentially support a pawn advance or counterplay. This move prepares to support the d-pawn with the queenside pawns, aiming to create counterplay on the queenside and potentially establish a queenside majority. This move repositions the rook to the open f-file, aiming to coordinate with the other rook for increased pressure on white's kingside or to support potential pawn breaks. This move repositions the rook to a more active file, aiming to exert pressure on black's queenside and support potential pawn advancements. Black's queen repositions to g5, eyeing potential tactics on the kingside and maintaining pressure on the f4 pawn, while also preparing for possible exchanges to simplify the position. This move aims to prevent black from activating their queen further by creating a safe square for the white king and potentially preparing a g4 push to gain space on the kingside. This move seeks to centralize the queen and potentially exploit the semi-open f-file created by white's pawn pushes. White develops the queen to a more active square, preparing to exert pressure on the kingside and potentially support an advance of the g-pawn. This move, 41, k4, centralizes the queen, contesting the key e4 square and aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially create counterplay on the kingside. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, preparing to contest the open file and potentially support an advance on the kingside. This move aims to contest the open a file, potentially creating a passed pawn on the queenside if the queenside pawns are pushed, while also preparing to activate the rook or support further pawn advances. The move d5 is a decisive positional pawn break, aiming to destabilize black's central structure and potentially create a passed pawn if black is not careful with their exchanges. The move 43, bd7 repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to support the pawn advance or potentially trade off black's weaker pieces while preparing for future counterplay on the queenside. This move establishes a passed pawn on d6, which aims to disrupt black's coordination and potentially become a decisive attacking force if supported. This move challenges white's advanced pawn, aiming to disrupt its control and potentially open lines for black's pieces, while also creating a more active defense for the rook. This pawn push aims to create mating threats on the kingside by opening lines or preparing for a subsequent attack, while also potentially forcing concessions from black's pieces. With white's d-pawn advancing to d6, the black king must seek a safer square, and kg7 is a reasonable choice to avoid immediate threats and prepare for potential counterplay. This move reroutes the knight to a more active square, potentially supporting a kingside attack or preparing to contest central squares. The move 46, kh6 is an attempt to disengage the king from the dangerous diagonal and potential checks on the h-file, while also preparing to possibly activate the king on the kingside or centralize it in the endgame. This pawn push opens a critical file for the rook and threatens to expose the black king, while also aiming to disrupt the advanced black pawn structure. This pawn recapture opens the h-file, creating critical attacking lines for black's rook and queen against the white king's defenses. White's queen repositions to a more active square, aiming to attack the weak pawns on the queenside and potentially create threats against the black king. This move initiates a pawn advance on the kingside, aiming to create attacking chances by opening lines for the rook and potentially creating a passed pawn. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, preparing to challenge black's queenside majority and potentially create tactical threats. This move initiates a queenside pawn expansion, aiming to create counterplay and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure while preparing to activate the queenside pieces. This move repositions the rook to a more active file, aiming to create threats along the d-file and potentially support a pawn push, while also preparing to defend key squares. This move initiates a desperate attempt to create complications and exploit the newly opened diagonal for the black queen, hoping to disrupt white's otherwise solid position and potentially force an advantageous exchange or win material. This move prepares to reinforce the king's position after black's probing queen check, ensuring safety while maintaining central tension. This move aims to activate the king by bringing it to a more central and active position, preparing for potential counterplay or defense in the endgame, especially with the queen still on the board. This move, ing4, repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to control central squares and potentially prepare for attacking operations on the kingside, especially considering black's king is somewhat exposed. This exchange simplifies black's position and allows white to activate their rook on the open d-file, potentially pressuring black's king. The capture with the rook on g4 opens the h-file for white's king and creates a passed pawn on the 7th rank, significantly improving white's attacking chances. The move 53. QD1 aims to exploit the loose rook on g4 by creating a discovered attack threat on white's king, with the queen and potentially winning material, while also repositioning the queen to a more active central square. This rook move prepares to attack the queenside pawns and simultaneously defend the kingside, creating a powerful outpost for the rook on the d-file and potentially initiating a decisive attack. Black's defensive structure has been compromised, and the move aims to bring the queen back into the game to support the central pawns and potentially create counterplay. The pawn on d7 is now poised to become a dangerous passed pawn, forcing black to commit resources to stopping it and potentially creating weaknesses in their position. This move is a desperate attempt to create counterplay by sacrificing the queen for an exchange and a pawn, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety. But white can simply capture the queen and maintain a winning material advantage. This move re-centers the king to safety after the aggressive advances and sacrifices, consolidating the position and preparing for potential endgame scenarios. 56. Qf5 attempts to simplify the position with exchanges. But black must be careful not to open too many lines for white's active king and pawns after the inevitable exchanges. The move 57. Qd3 attacks the pawn on d4 and reinforces the knight on e3, preparing to defend against black's potential kingside attack while maintaining central pressure.